The words hit harder than any bullet ever could. Margaret's voice carried the weight of 20 years' silence, and now it shattered against the adobe walls of the Whitmore ranch like glass against stone. Thomas Whitmore, the richest man in 3 counties, stood frozen in his mahogany-paneled study, watching his reflection fracture in the window that overlooked his vast empire. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, but inside, the space between them had become an unbridgeable chasm. Her truth hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, ugly, suffocating, final, subscribed to witness how even the mightiest can fall when love becomes the cruelest judge of all. The grandfather clock in the corner had been counting Thomas Whitmore's heartbeats for 43 years, and tonight it seemed to mock him with each deliberate tick. His hands, weathered from decades of building an empire from dust and determination, trembled as they gripped the crystal tumbler filled with whiskey that tasted like ash. The amber liquid caught the lamplight, creating patterns that danced across the Persian rug his late father had brought from back east, a rug that had witnessed more loneliness than celebration. Margaret stood by the fireplace, her silhouette sharp against the dying flames, and Thomas could see in her posture the same rigid dignity she'd carried since the day she'd arrived as his housekeeper 20 years ago. The silence between them stretched like the vast desert beyond his windows, filled with all the words they'd never dared to speak. Her simple black dress seemed to absorb the light, making her appear like a shadow that had finally found its voice. The ranch house groaned around them, its timbers settling into the familiar rhythm of another sleepless night. Thomas had built this mansion to rival any estate in San Francisco, with its imported chandeliers and hand-carved staircases, but tonight it felt like an elaborate tomb. The portraits of his ancestors watched from their gilded frames, their painted eyes holding the same cold judgment he'd grown accustomed to seeing in mirrors. Margaret's breathing was the only sound that seemed real in this cathedral of accumulated wealth, each exhale carrying the weight of 2 decades spent in service to a man who had everything except the one thing that mattered. The fire crackled weakly, casting shadows that seemed to reach toward them like grasping fingers. Thomas realized that in all his years of acquisition and expansion, he had never learned how to hold on to something as fragile as human affection. The distance between them, merely 6 feet of polished hardwood, felt like the span between earth and stars. Outside, the wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, but inside the study, the air had grown thick with unspoken truths. Thomas had always prided himself on his ability to read the market, to sense when cattle prices would rise or when drought would come, but he had been blind to the storm brewing in Margaret's heart. Her fingers traced the edge of the mantelpiece, and he noticed how her wedding ring, the simple gold band from her first marriage, caught the firelight like a small beacon of a life he had never been part of. The leather-bound ledgers on his desk documented every transaction, every profit, every expansion of his empire, but they contained no record of the moments when Margaret had brought him coffee during late-night planning sessions, or the way her eyes had softened when she thought he wasn't looking. The grandfather clock chimed 11, and Thomas felt each note like a nail being driven into the coffin of his hopes. He had conquered drought, outlasted competitors, and turned a modest inheritance into a fortune that stretched across 3 states. But he had never learned how to bridge the chasm between employer and beloved. The whiskey burned his throat, but not as much as the realization that Margaret had been preparing for this moment longer than he had been dreading it. Her hands were steady as she adjusted the family photograph on the mantel, a picture of her late husband and the children she'd lost to fever, the family that had been taken from her before she'd come to work for the Whitmores. Thomas had always known about her losses, had even attended the funeral of her youngest, but he had never understood how those ghosts shaped every decision she made. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny prayers ascending to an indifferent heaven. Margaret's profile was etched against the warm glow, and Thomas could see in her expression the same resolve that had carried her through grief and hardship. The Persian rug beneath his feet had cost more than most men earned in a lifetime, but it couldn't cushion the impact of what was coming. He had spent 43 years building walls of wealth and status, never realizing that the woman he loved had been standing outside them all along. The study had always been his sanctuary, the place where he made decisions that affected hundreds of lives and thousands of acres. Tonight, it felt like a courtroom where he was about to receive a verdict he had no power to appeal. Margaret turned from the fireplace, and in her movement, Thomas saw the grace that had first caught his attention 2 decades ago. Not the practiced elegance of society women, but the natural dignity of someone who had faced life's cruelest blows and remained standing. The lamplight revealed the silver threads in her dark hair, the lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure. Thomas had offered her everything he thought valuable: security, comfort, a position of respect in his household. But he had never offered her the one thing she had never asked for, his heart laid bare, without the armor of wealth and position. The clock's pendulum swung back and forth like a metronome, counting down to an execution. Margaret's lips parted, and Thomas knew that whatever words came next would either save him or destroy the last illusion he had about love being something that could be earned rather than freely given. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap under the weight of 20 years of careful distance and unspoken longing. Thomas set down his whiskey glass with hands that had signed million-dollar contracts without trembling, but now shook like autumn leaves in a bitter wind. Margaret's eyes met his across the expanse of his carefully ordered world, and in them he saw not the gratitude he had expected, not the deference he had grown accustomed to, but something far more devastating: pity mixed with a love that had curdled into resignation. The fire behind her was dying, much like the hope he had carried in secret for so many years. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, and Thomas Whitmore, who had never lost a business negotiation, never backed down from a fight, never admitted defeat, felt his empire of pride crumble into dust with 4 simple words that would haunt him until his dying day. Margaret's words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Thomas felt something inside his chest crack like ice on a winter pond. The mirror above the fireplace reflected his face back at him, the face she had just declared ugly, the face that had smiled at governors and railroad barons, the face that had never been called handsome but had always commanded respect. Now he saw what she saw, the heavy jowls that prosperity had carved, the eyes that had grown small and calculating from years of measuring everything in terms of profit and loss, the mouth that had forgotten how to speak words of tenderness. The grandfather clock continued its relentless counting, but time seemed to have stopped in this room, where his heart was learning the difference between being feared and being loved. Margaret remained by the fireplace, her silhouette unwavering, and Thomas realized that her stillness was not submission, but the calm that comes after a long-fought battle has finally ended. The Persian rug beneath his feet might as well have been quicksand, pulling him down into a truth he had spent decades avoiding. The whiskey glass sat abandoned on his desk, its contents growing warm like everything else in this room that had once felt like a fortress but now felt like a prison. Thomas had always believed that wealth was a kind of beauty, that success could transform even the plainest features into something admirable. But Margaret's words had stripped away that illusion like wind stripping leaves from a dying tree. He thought of all the mirrors in this house, the ornate one in the grand foyer, the silver-framed glass in his bedroom, the small shaving mirror in his private washroom, and realized that none of them had ever shown him the truth that Margaret's eyes revealed tonight. The fire crackled weakly, casting shadows that seemed to dance in mockery of his pain. Outside, his cattle grazed on land that stretched to the horizon. His horses ran free in pastures that bore his name. But inside this study, he was poorer than the humblest cowhand who had ever known the touch of genuine affection. The ledgers on his desk documented every acre acquired, every head of cattle purchased, every dollar earned, but they contained no entry for the cost of a heart that had forgotten how to love without expecting something in return. Margaret moved away from the fireplace, and her footsteps on the hardwood floor sounded like the measured pace of a funeral procession. Thomas watched her reflection in the window, superimposed over the vast darkness of his ranch, and saw how small she looked against the backdrop of his accumulated possessions. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent his life making himself larger, more important, more influential, while the woman he loved had remained constant, unchanged, real, in a way that all his wealth could never make him. The family photographs on the mantel seemed to watch their silent drama with the patience of the dead, and Thomas wondered if Margaret's late husband had ever looked at her the way Thomas was looking at her now, with the desperate hunger of a man who had just realized he was starving. The fire popped again, sending another shower of sparks up the chimney, and Thomas felt each spark like a small piece of his pride burning away. He had built this empire to prove his worth, to show the world that Thomas Whitmore was a man to be reckoned with. But Margaret's words had revealed the hollow core at the center of all his achievements. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that no amount of money could bridge, and Thomas found himself remembering the first time he had seen Margaret, a young widow with 2 small children, standing in his kitchen with her back straight and her chin raised despite the desperation in her eyes. He had hired her out of what he told himself was charity, but even then he had been drawn to something in her that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with a longing he had never learned to name. Over the years, he had watched her children grow and leave, had seen her bury her grief and build a new life within the walls of his house, had fallen in love with her quiet strength and the way she moved through his world without being diminished by it. But he had never told her any of this, had hidden his feelings behind the safe distance of employer and employee, master and servant, rich man and poor woman. The grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour, and Thomas realized that time was not just passing but running out, slipping away like water through his fingers. Margaret's profile was etched against the dying firelight, and he could see in her expression the same finality that had marked her face at her children's graves. The study felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in around them, and Thomas understood that this room, which had always been his sanctuary, was about to become the site of his greatest defeat. Margaret's hands were folded in front of her, and he noticed how they bore the calluses of honest work, the small scars of a life lived in service to others, the simple dignity of someone who had never needed wealth to know her own worth. The contrast between her hands and his own, soft from years of signing papers rather than working land, adorned with rings that proclaimed his status, seemed to summarize everything that was wrong with his life. The fire was dying, and Thomas made no move to add another log, sensing that this conversation was meant to take place in growing darkness, that some truths could only be spoken when the light was fading. Margaret turned to face him fully, and in her eyes he saw not hatred but something far worse, the kind of love that had been tested and found wanting, the kind of affection that had been offered quietly for years and never acknowledged, never returned, never valued until it was too late. The Persian rug beneath his feet had been woven by hands that understood beauty, but Thomas realized that he had spent his entire life surrounded by beautiful things without ever learning to recognize beauty when it stood before him in a simple black dress, speaking words that would echo in his heart until his dying day. The moment had arrived when all the careful structures of their relationship, the polite distance, the professional courtesy, the unspoken boundaries, were about to crumble like a house built on sand. Thomas felt his throat constrict, as if an invisible hand were squeezing the life from him, and he realized that Margaret's words were not just an observation, but a prophecy, a glimpse into a future where he would indeed die unmourned, except by the one person whose love he had taken for granted. The grandfather clock's ticking seemed to grow louder, marking not just the passage of time, but the countdown to a loneliness so complete that all his wealth would become meaningless. Margaret's face was illuminated by the last flames of the dying fire, and Thomas saw in her expression the terrible beauty of someone who had finally found the courage to speak a truth that would set her free and leave him forever imprisoned in the golden cage he had built around his heart. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Whitmore estate, but Thomas remained in the darkness of his study, staring at the untouched whiskey glass that had sat on his mahogany desk since dawn. The amber liquid caught fragments of light streaming through heavy curtains, creating tiny prisons of illumination that reminded him of Sarah's eyes when she had spoken those words. He had built an empire on this land, accumulated wealth that could buy entire towns, yet he could not purchase back the moment before she had looked at him with such devastating honesty. The silence of the house pressed against him like a physical weight, each creak of settling wood echoing the hollow spaces within his chest where pride had once resided. His reflection in the window showed him what Sarah had seen: the sharp angles of a face carved by years of commanding others, the cold blue eyes that had intimidated business partners and broken weaker men, the mouth that had never learned to speak gentle words. Thomas touched his cheek, feeling the roughness of skin, weathered by desert winds and hardened by a lifetime of believing that strength meant never showing weakness. The irony cut deeper than any blade. He had spent decades perfecting the very features that now stood as monuments to his isolation. Every line spoke of power exercised without mercy. Every shadow revealed the absence of warmth that money could never restore. The sound of horses approaching broke through his reverie, and Thomas watched as his foreman rode up with 3 ranch hands, their faces grim with the weight of bad news. Through the glass, he could see them dismounting with the careful movements of men who carried burdens heavier than their bodies could bear. The drought had claimed another section of grazing land, the cattle were dying faster than they could be moved to water, and the neighboring ranches were beginning to circle like vultures, sensing weakness in the Whitmore Empire. Yet as Thomas prepared to face these earthly concerns, he realized that Sarah's words had stripped him of the armor he had always worn into battle, leaving him naked before challenges that suddenly seemed insurmountable. He opened the study door and stepped into the hallway, his boots echoing against polished floors that stretched like a canyon between him and the front entrance. The portraits of his ancestors watched from their gilded frames, their painted eyes holding the same cold authority that had been his inheritance and his curse. Each generation of Whitmore men had added to the family fortune, expanded the boundaries of their domain, and died alone in rooms filled with everything except the one thing that mattered. Thomas paused before his father's portrait, seeing in those familiar features the blueprint for his own emotional bankruptcy, the genetic legacy of men who had confused accumulation with accomplishment. The foreman's knock came like thunder against the heavy oak door, and Thomas felt his body automatically straighten into the posture of command that had become as natural as breathing. But beneath the familiar mask, something fundamental had shifted during the long night of Sarah's revelation, like a foundation stone that had finally cracked under the weight of too many years. He could feel the careful architecture of his identity beginning to sway, threatening to collapse into the very dust that covered his dying cattle. The man who opened the door would still be Thomas Whitmore, but the man who had closed it the night before, the man who had believed his wealth could eventually win any heart, that man had died with Sarah's words. As his hand touched the brass handle, Thomas understood that he was about to step into a world where his money meant nothing, where his power was revealed as the elaborate illusion it had always been, and where the only currency that mattered was the very thing he had never learned to offer, the vulnerable truth of a human heart that had forgotten how to love without trying to own. Sarah's cottage sat like a forgotten prayer at the edge of Whitmore land, its weathered walls holding secrets that the desert wind had tried for years to steal. She moved through the small rooms with the careful grace of someone who had learned to find beauty in simplicity, her hands touching surfaces worn smooth by years of honest labor and quiet dreams. The morning light filtered through curtains she had sewn herself, casting gentle patterns across floors that had never known the weight of expensive boots or the echo of empty grandeur. In this humble space, she had built a life that Thomas's millions could never purchase, a sanctuary where worth was measured not in gold, but in the small acts of tenderness that filled each day with meaning. The mirror above her washstand reflected a face that bore the marks of a different kind of wealth, lines earned through laughter, shared with friends who valued her heart over her circumstances, eyes that held the clarity of someone who had never compromised her soul for comfort. Sarah traced the scar along her left temple, a reminder of the accident that had left her face forever changed, and her prospects in Clearwater's marriage market permanently diminished. She had watched other women her age find husbands and build families while she remained invisible, her worth dismissed by men who could not see past the surface to the treasure that lay beneath. Yet in that invisibility, she had discovered a freedom that the beautiful women of the town would never know, the liberty to speak truth without fear of losing what she had never possessed. The sound of her neighbor's children playing in the distance brought a smile to her lips, their voices carrying the pure joy that money could never manufacture. Sarah had spent countless afternoons teaching them to read, watching their faces light up as words transformed from mysterious symbols into doorways to other worlds. These moments had taught her that the most precious gifts were those that could not be bought or sold. The true wealth lay in the connections between souls rather than the accumulation of possessions. She thought of Thomas in his vast, empty house, surrounded by luxury, but starved of the simple human warmth that filled her modest cottage like sunlight. Her hands moved to the letter she had begun writing the night before, words that had poured from her heart like water from a broken dam. For years, she had watched Thomas from afar, seeing past his harsh exterior to the lonely man who had forgotten how to be vulnerable, recognizing in his isolation the same hunger for connection that had driven her own quiet acts of service to others. The letter contained truths she had never dared speak aloud, confessions of a love that had grown not from admiration of his wealth, but from glimpses of the wounded boy who still lived behind his cold blue eyes. She had seen him once, years ago, standing alone at his mother's grave, his shoulders shaking with grief he thought no one could witness. The decision to speak those cruel words had not come from malice, but from a desperate hope that shock might accomplish what gentleness had failed to achieve. Sarah had watched too many people approach Thomas with flattery and false deference, feeding the very pride that kept him imprisoned in his golden tower. Her words had been a key forged from honesty, designed to unlock the cage he had built around his heart, even if it meant sacrificing her own comfort in the process. She understood that sometimes love required the courage to wound in order to heal, to tear down walls even when the debris might bury the one who wielded the hammer. As she folded the letter and placed it in her apron pocket, Sarah felt the weight of a choice that would determine not only her own future, but perhaps the salvation of a man who had everything except the one thing that could save him. The morning sun climbed higher, casting her shadow long across the floor, and she knew that before it set again, she would either help Thomas find his way back to his humanity, or watch him retreat so far into his fortress of wealth that no voice would ever reach him again. The afternoon heat shimmered across the Whitmore ranch like liquid silver, distorting the horizon until earth and sky became one endless mirage of possibility and loss. Thomas rode his black stallion across land that bore his name but no longer felt like home, each hoofbeat marking time in a life that had suddenly revealed itself as a carefully constructed lie. The cattle that remained alive moved like ghosts through the dying grass, their eyes holding the same hollow desperation he recognized in his own reflection. Behind him, the great house stood like a monument to everything he had achieved and everything he had failed to become, its windows catching the sun like tears that would never fall. The letter in his coat pocket seemed to burn against his chest. Sarah's words, written in the careful script of someone who had learned to make every word count. She had delivered it herself that morning, standing at his door with the quiet dignity of a queen addressing a conquered kingdom, her scarred face radiant with a beauty that had nothing to do with conventional features and everything to do with the courage to speak truth in a world built on comfortable lies. He had read her words a dozen times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning, new depths of understanding about the man he had become and the man he might still choose to be. The wind carried the scent of rain from distant mountains, a promise of redemption that seemed as impossible as the transformation Sarah's letter demanded of him. She had written of love, not the desperate, grasping kind that sought to possess, but the patient, nurturing love that asked nothing except the chance to help another soul remember its own worth. Her words painted a picture of the man she saw beneath his harsh exterior, the frightened boy who had learned to armor himself in wealth because he had never been taught that vulnerability was not weakness, but the foundation of all genuine strength. She offered him not her submission, but her partnership in the difficult work of becoming human again. Thomas dismounted near the creek that marked the boundary between his land and the open desert, kneeling beside water that ran clear and cold despite the drought that ravaged everything else. In its surface, he saw not the powerful rancher who commanded respect through fear, but a man whose face had forgotten how to smile, whose hands had grown skilled at taking but clumsy at giving. The realization struck him like lightning. He had spent so many years building walls to protect himself from rejection that he had created a prison that kept out not only pain, but every form of joy that made life worth living. Sarah's cruel words had been the earthquake that finally brought those walls tumbling down. The sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of Sarah's hair when she stood in firelight. Thomas understood that he faced a choice that would define not only the remainder of his days, but the very essence of who he would choose to be in whatever time remained to him. He could retreat into the familiar fortress of his wealth, surrounding himself with servants and sycophants who would never challenge him to grow, or he could walk the difficult path that Sarah's letter had illuminated, the journey back to his own humanity, with all the risks and rewards that such vulnerability entailed. As darkness began to claim the desert, Thomas mounted his horse and turned toward town, toward the small cottage where a woman with a scarred face and a perfect heart waited to discover whether her gamble had saved a soul or simply driven it deeper into the wilderness of its own making. The stars emerged one by one above him, each point of light a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, beauty could still find a way to shine. Behind him, the great house stood empty, its rooms echoing with the ghosts of a life half-lived, while ahead lay the uncertain promise of a love that demanded everything he had never learned to give, and offered in return the only treasure that his money had never been able to buy. In his pocket, Sarah's letter rustled with each movement of his horse, its words already memorized, but their meaning still unfolding like a flower that bloomed only in the soil of a heart, finally ready to be broken open and made new.